Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us, and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city. Perhaps the next story about betrayal will be from your city, and we start. Mark Harrington woke up early in the morning, as usual, a few minutes before the alarm went off. He lay looking at the ceiling, thinking that his wife, Emily, had been completely different for a few weeks now. They had been married for 6 years, but had not yet had time to have children either because of constant employment or because of some elusive fears that both tried not to discuss. Their family life seemed smooth, almost cloudless, until barely noticeable, but increasingly alarming cracks began to appear in the relationship. Here's another day, Mark thought and sighed. He carefully slipped out from under the blanket so as not to disturb the sleeping Emily, but turning around, he caught himself thinking, she usually gets up before him. Recently, more and more oddities have appeared in her habits, and the fact that she had not yet jumped up and ran to do yoga or cook breakfast also looked unusual. Walking over to the bathroom sink, he glanced at his reflection in the mirror. Healthy, fit, short-cropped brown hair, strong arms, and light stubble indicated that he had not lost shape over the years. He never lacked a sense of self-confidence. He knew how to control himself in any situation. He was what his friends called a reliable support. But now questions were bubbling beneath the calm surface, and the first thing that flashed in my mind was, what's wrong with Emily? When he entered the kitchen, Emily was already sitting there. Outwardly, everything looked normal. Skinny jeans, a simple white t-shirt, a warm sweater thrown over his shoulders. But the look, this distant look, as if she was somewhere far away from him. "Morning," Mark said quietly, hoping that his voice wouldn't show how tense he was. She turned around. "Hello," Emily responded. There was no former tenderness in the voice. The pause lasted just long enough for Mark to understand that today they would not have the usual family chat over a cup of coffee. He put the Turk on the stove and started making coffee. Out of habit, he opened the cabinet to take out their favorite ceramic mugs with their names on them, M for Mark and E for Emily. After a moment's hesitation, he put Emelina's mug back and took out another one without any inscriptions. He did it so quickly and subtly that Emily herself did not seem to notice. But for him, this gesture became symbolic. He felt something familiar and comfortable leaving their lives. "How did you sleep?" he asked in a neutral tone, trying to somehow start a conversation. "Fine. I'm just tired," she sighed and, pushing back her chair, began fiddling with her phone on the table. "There's a lot to do at work." Mark nodded, although Emily used to love to talk about her projects, sharing her plans and successes. Now any questions about work ran into an invisible wall. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed how she quickly pressed something on the phone, hiding the screen from his view. Is she hiding something? The thought pierced, but Mark restrained himself. He didn't want scandals and certainly didn't want to look like a jealous husband who checks his wife's every call and message. Moreover, until recently, it would never have occurred to her before Emily was open. The phone lay anywhere, sometimes forgotten, discharged. Now she carries the gadget everywhere. The coffee was almost ready. The smell of the bittersweet drink calmed Mark a little. He poured the hot liquid into mugs and placed one in front of her. "Thank you," she said casually, without looking up. "Can you tell me what's bothering you?" he asked quietly. It's too direct a question, but Mark is tired of beating around the bush. Emily shrugged her shoulders slightly. "It's just that a lot of things have piled up." "Really, everything is fine. Don't worry." From the way her lips trembled, it became clear that she was lying, and Mark felt some kind of ice forming inside him. But did he show it on the outside? Most likely not. He was too used to being reliable and reserved. He didn't want to scare her or drive her into a corner. He was sure that he would find out the truth. He just had to wait for time. At work that day passed for Mark in routine meetings, calculations, and negotiations. He worked in a consulting company where everything was based on numbers and facts. But the thought that something was wrong at home did not leave him. More than once he caught himself automatically looking at his watch and wondering what Emily was doing right now. At lunchtime, when his colleagues gathered in the cafeteria, he stepped aside and found his wife's number in his phone. But he didn't call. I just looked at the screen and imagined how she could answer dryly and formally or not pick up the phone at all. He didn't want a scene, didn't want to feel like a suspicious, jealous person. He had always been proud that he and Emily had a relationship based on trust. Or were they founded? A painful thought pricked me. Later that day, late in the evening, when Mark was about to leave the office, a mutual friend, Sophia, called him. A woman of about 35 who was considered a great diplomat in their circle of friends and knew how to quietly fish out information. "Hello, Mark. How are you and Emily? Long time no see." Sophia's voice sounded wary. "Yes, as usual." He smiled into the phone, trying to seem at ease. "What happened? I just wanted to know if she got sick by chance. Doesn't answer my calls or messages. We used to chat often." Sophia paused. "Tell me honestly, is everything okay?" He debated for a moment whether to answer directly, but in the end, he only calmly answered, "Yes, she's very busy at work right now." That's it. The lie stuck in my throat like a prickly lump. Having finished the conversation, Mark felt slightly irritated he himself was beginning to cover up his wife's incomprehensible behavior. However, he still looked firm and calm. "I need to know the truth," he whispered under his breath, but without unnecessary drama. When he returned home, the first thing he noticed was that Emily's car was in the garage, but the house was quiet. Leaving his briefcase at the door, he called, "Are you here?" Silence. I went into the kitchen, it was empty. In the living room, on the couch, I found her purse, and a scarf was lying next to it. The TV was turned off. He went further and climbed the stairs to the second floor. A knock in the bedroom told her she was there. Carefully opening the door, I saw her standing with the phone by the window. When he appeared, she shuddered and quickly hid the gadget in her pocket, and she immediately began to speak, as if she was preparing to justify herself in advance. "Hello, I'm upstairs. I came home from work early. My head hurts. I needed to lie down." The voice sounded somehow unconvincing, but Mark did not prick her. Maintaining his usual firmness, he came up and tried to take her hand. "Maybe we should call a doctor, or should we buy painkillers?" Emily pulled away. "No need, I can handle it myself. I'll take a shower and have dinner, it will pass." She brushed past her to leave the room, and he exhaled slowly, feeling the tension between them grow. He himself could not understand what angered him more, the fact that she was lying about something, or the fact that she did not dare to simply say what was happening. But Mark consciously chose the path of restraint and observation. He didn't want to throw tantrums and didn't like to meddle in other people's affairs for no reason, even if it's his wife's business. Half an hour later, they were sitting at the table in the living room. Emily ate almost nothing, only picked at the ready-made dinner from a local restaurant with a fork. Mark, on the other hand, was finishing his steak with gusto and watching her nervously glance at her phone. In the end, he couldn't stand it. I'm not judging you, and I'm not going to force you to do anything, but you're clearly hiding something. Why are you doing this?" She looked at him from under her brows and answered sharply, "It seemed to you. It's just work and fatigue. Maybe you'll say it after all." He didn't even raise his voice, but his deep baritone sounded harsh. "Mark, I don't want to talk about this right now," she interrupted rudely, crumpling up the napkin and throwing it on the table. "Stop asking questions. Leave me alone." With these words, she abruptly stood up and went into the bedroom. He remained sitting at the table and felt something inside him shrinking. If earlier such outbursts were rare and quickly subsided, now she behaved irritably and distantly on a constant basis. Mark understood that this was no longer a minor quarrel, but something more serious. "So you need to pull yourself together and not put pressure on her. Find out what's wrong, but don't break the relationship," he whispered to himself. He put away the dishes and was about to go up to the bedroom to try to talk again, but he heard a sound. Ting! A message came on his phone. He looked at the screen. "Mark, hi, this is Jason. We're meeting at my house tomorrow about a new project, remember?" Write if everything is in your power. Mark breathed a sigh of relief. At least the work continued to go according to plan. He sent Jason a short, "Okay, I will," after which he turned off all instant messengers and went into the gloomy bedroom. Emily was already lying under the blanket with her back to him. He quietly walked to his side of the bed and lay down, trying not to disturb his wife. And 1,000 questions continued to burn inside. The next morning, Emily left before he could get up. However, the premonition of bad changes did not disappear. Rather, it intensified. He sat on the edge of the bed and noticed her handkerchief casually left on the chair next to her business suit. I thought, she always neatly lays out her clothes, and now she was in such a hurry that she forgot. Every little thing reminded him of the changes taking place. Checking the kitchen, he saw a barely finished glass of orange juice. Usually she liked to start the day with a classic Americano or latte, but today she suddenly had juice, and it looked like she didn't finish it. This was another detail confirming that she had become a stranger, distant. The day passed quickly, with worries and meetings, but towards evening Mark got ready to meet Jason, his friend and business partner. He couldn't wait to get away from family worries. Maybe in a man's conversation he would find a hint on what to do. Jason lived in the same suburb, just 10 minutes away. His house was a large, old mansion, which had once been inherited by the family. Now it looked respectable and cozy at the same time. The grass was being cut on the lawn, warm light was burning in the windows. Mark parked, got out of the car, and took a deep breath. It was already beginning to get dark, and the surroundings were immersed in calm. "Hi, buddy," Jason, a tall man of 40 years old, with whom Mark had long been involved in business projects and had been friends for almost 15 years, greeted him at the entrance. "Come in, settle down. How's life?" Mark shrugged. "Fine. Everything is going smoothly at work. Our plans, too, I think, will be successful." They went into the home office, where everything was furnished with expensive but discreet furniture. There were photographs on the walls, Jason with his family, friends, colleagues. "Will you have some whiskey?" the owner suggested, already taking out a bottle. "Yes, pour a little," Mark responded. When Jason handed him the glass, he twirled the crystal cut in his hand, looking at the amber liquid. I felt like I should tell my friend about the problems with Emily. But Mark did not dare. Where to start? He was not used to asking for help in such matters. I never wanted to look vulnerable. "Listen," Jason began cautiously after a minute's pause. "I know that we're kind of here for work, but are you okay?" "What's wrong?" Mark tensed. "Yes, you don't look like yourself. Usually cheerful, charged, but now he looks kind of gloomy. It's like you're carrying a weight on your shoulders." Jason calmly took a sip from his glass and looked at his friend. "Maybe there are problems in the marriage." Mark didn't want to discuss this, but seeing his friend's frankness, he only squeezed out briefly, "There are some difficulties. Emily is different, and I don't understand why." Jason shook his head knowingly. "Listen, I'm not a psychologist or an expert on the female soul, but I know one thing for sure. Never lie to yourself and don't try to deceive your wife by saying that everything is okay. If you see that something is wrong, talk, even if it is painful." I tried, but she pushed me away. Doesn't make contact at all. It looks like, I don't know, it looks like she's hiding something. Maybe she had someone on the side. The last words were difficult for Mark, but he still said them. "Is there any reason to think so?" Jason asked calmly. Mark shrugged. "Behavior, secrecy, telephone." "Yes, I don't want to seem jealous, but it looks like she's looking the other way." "Well, on the other hand," Jason stood up and walked around the room, "you're a man. If you really feel something is going on, have the courage to clear it up. I'm not saying burst into her phone and stuff. But show that you are strong. Don't keep quiet. Don't feel sorry for her if she doesn't feel sorry for herself." At that moment, Mark caught his friend's thought. You don't need to show weakness and endure if you feel like you're being deceived. And although he didn't want to turn into a scout sniffing out clues, he knew that nothing would change until he took action. "Yes," Mark said briefly, feeling a firm decision emerging inside. I won't run from her. Mark woke up at dawn with a determination that had been smoldering inside him for weeks. After countless half-hints and subterfuges, he finally decided to pose the question head-on. He felt that if he didn't do this now, he would never be able to regain his peace of mind. What's the point of carrying a load of omissions on your shoulders if it eats you up from the inside? Emily was away from home for 2 days, citing urgent matters at work and spending the night with a friend. Mark listened silently, trying to understand by intonation whether she was lying or telling the truth. Everything indicated that he was lying, but this time he did not patiently clench his teeth and wait for her to deign to return. He kept track of time, waiting for her to appear on their doorstep again. When Emily returned, the house was unusually quiet. No music, no familiar smell of cooked dinner. Only cold walls and the feeling that she had not been expected here for a long time. She entered, tried to smile, threw a light cloak off her shoulders, and looked around. "Hello," she said somewhat hesitantly, meeting his gaze. "Sit down," Mark said, pointing to a chair in the living room. He remained standing. His posture and voice betrayed determination, and at the same time there was a cold aloofness in him that she seemed to have never seen before. Did something happen? Emily put her bag on the floor and stared at him. Looking at Mark, she saw his travel bag lying next to him on the sofa, almost empty, but half open, as if he was about to leave. "Yes, it happened," he answered calmly, although everything was seething inside. "It's time for us to talk." She nodded, sat cross-legged, and tried to appear calm, but sparks of anxiety were already dancing in her eyes. "I don't understand what," she began, but he interrupted her without rudeness, but in an extremely harsh tone. "Let's go without it. We've been beating around the bush for too long. You yourself know what we're talking about." She took a sharp breath, as if preparing to defend herself. There was a heavy pause in the room. Mark stood opposite her, his arms crossed over his chest. The sunlight through the window cast a stern shadow on his face, and Emily suddenly felt that his former gentleness had evaporated. "Who is he?" he asked finally. Emily turned pale. A shadow passed over her face, as if in her soul she was either struggling with the desire to lie or trying to find words to soften the truth. "There's no one," she tried weakly. Mark just clenched his jaw, paused, and looked straight into her eyes. There was no pleading or weakness in this look, only inflexibility. "Okay," she said suddenly, with a sigh, breaking the silence. "Since you insist so much, I didn't want it to turn out this way." And her voice trembled slightly. "Speak." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if collecting her thoughts, then quietly squeezed out. "His name is Trevor. I." She hesitated, not knowing how to formulate. "We met by chance in a bar. I drank heavily. I didn't think straight. He started flirting." Mark was silent, but something inside him seemed to break. Although he suspected betrayal, hearing everything with his own eyes was 10 times more painful. "I wasn't going to do anything," Emily continued, breaking the tense atmosphere with her nervous speech. "But it turned out like this. A couple of cocktails, and it's like a clouding of reason. I feel terrible." She bit her lip, trying to sound remorseful. It was a stupid, isolated incident. Mark didn't raise an eyebrow as he listened to her confession. The fact that she finally said everything did not bring relief. It only coldly confirmed his worst fears. "And what happened next?" He asked a direct question without looking away. "Nothing more, I swear," she almost whispered. "After that night, I decided that we needed to stop all communication. He wrote, called, but I didn't answer. I was just afraid to tell you. I understood that I would ruin everything." At the last word, tears appeared in her voice, but Mark did not believe in the sincerity of this repentance. He saw how several feelings were fighting in her at once, making excuses, blaming alcohol, presenting herself as an unfortunate victim of circumstances. "You wanted to continue to hide everything," he remarked ruthlessly. "I was afraid," Emily answered plaintively. "I didn't know how you would react, and then you just decided to lie to my face." He finished her sentence dryly. Lie that you're busy at work, that you spend the night with your friends, that everything is fine, until I figure it out myself and force the truth out. Mark, she rose from her chair and took a couple of steps towards him. Forgive me, please. I swear it was a mistake. Her voice broke into tears. You know, I didn't want to. How many times have you seen him since that incident? He clarified coldly, not paying attention to her tears. Maybe a couple of times, she answered, lowering her eyes. But I quickly stopped. It doesn't mean anything, Mark. You are more important. Our marriage is more important. Her words sounded empty. He felt rage surging beyond the limits of his self-control. But instead of screaming, he simply took a short breath and looked away. More important, you say? He said quietly. What about your behavior in recent months? Hiding behind the phone, avoiding me, lying about work trips. Is this called marriage is more important? I tried to understand myself, she objected tearfully, desperately clutching at any justification formula. I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid that you. Afraid that I was what? Mark looked up at her. Will I throw you out into the street or start hitting the walls? No, you know me too well. I never made a scene for you. I didn't throw dishes. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my hand to you. You just didn't want to be responsible. That's it. The bitter truth hit Emily, and she nervously ran her hand through her hair. I'm confused. She sobbed, trying to look unhappy. Everything happened too quickly. Trevor. He was kind, gallant, and suddenly it blew me away. I thought we were no longer so close, but he spoke so interestingly. No need, Mark cut her off. I won't listen to you extol his kindness. I'll tell you straight, your behavior is disgusting. She tried to grab his hand, but he pulled away, not allowing her to even touch him. Mark, I beg you, listen. She began again, and tears flowed down her cheeks. But now he saw these tears differently. It was as if she felt more sorry for herself than for him. He felt contempt for her, but tried to keep his cool. I've already listened to everything, Emily. I have no questions for you. I wanted the truth, you told it, and you know, nothing else keeps me here. With these words, he turned to the sofa, took out a few things from his travel bag that he had managed to pack in the morning, and began to put the rest of what he needed there. What are you doing? There was fear in Emily's voice. I'm leaving, he said evenly, without looking at her. She gasped. Wait, Mark. I told you it was a mistake. I want to fix everything. Let's go to a psychologist. I love you, she muttered in a trembling voice, as if clutching at the last straw. He silently zipped up his bag and finally turned to her. His gaze was icy, indifferent, and impenetrable. No, Emily, you wanted to pretend that nothing happened. Continued to lie until I pinned you to the wall with questions. You don't love me. At least, not the way you need to love your husband if you were ready to hide this betrayal. But she sobbed, trying to squeeze out the words that she had always loved him, and that, they say, it was just one mistake. I'm not going to continue this circus, he snapped. No children's tantrums, no screams. I'm just leaving. I don't know where yet, but I definitely won't stay here. She stepped towards him, almost on her knees begging. Mark, please don't leave me now. Let's try to change everything. He straightened up to his full height. All his muscles were tense, but his voice remained firm. If you really wanted to change something, you would have found a way to be honest. I wouldn't prefer cheap lies and pathetic excuses. I got drunk. He confused me. We are both no longer youths. We are adults. You made a choice, and you didn't choose me. She covered her face with her hands and was already sobbing openly. But her tears met a blank wall. Mark looked at her with restrained bitterness, but without a hint of reassuring or hugging her. Okay, she muttered, realizing that maybe it was worth using a different tactic. She suddenly straightened up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Have you ever thought about why I suddenly wanted to go to that bar and have a drink? Maybe you should have paid more attention to me. Maybe you missed the moment when I became terribly lonely. She tries to turn everything around by making him look guilty. But Mark just grinned at the corner of his lips. So it's my fault. Have you decided that if I pay little attention to your complaints, then the best solution is to break up our marriage and go to bed with the first person I meet? This is a weak argument. She remained silent, realizing that such attempts at manipulation only caused him disgust. I don't want to listen to this chatter anymore, Mark said quietly, picking up his bag from the floor again. Everything has already been decided. He walked around her, heading towards the door. Emily, realizing that she was losing him here and now, frantically grabbed him by the hem of his jacket. But he broke free from her grip without any unnecessary sudden movements easily, but in such a way that he made it clear, this is the end. Mark's head was noisy. He wanted to curse, scream about how she humiliated and deceived him. But he learned long ago to control himself and not shout when emotions run high. Calmness and coldness are the best answers to this lie. Last advice, he said without turning around. Don't try to blame it on alcohol or circumstances. Just admit that you knowingly betrayed me. Accept the consequences. Then maybe, at least you can continue to live without illusions. With these words, he opened the front door and went out. Emily stepped after him, but did not dare to stop him, as if something in his posture and face made it clear that it was useless. He walked to the car, opened the trunk, and put his bag inside. I got behind the wheel, started the engine, and she stood on the porch, pale, with a tear-stained face, not finding a word to turn the situation in her favor. The car slowly drove away from the house, and Mark didn't turn around even once. On the way, he felt a mixed feeling of pain and contempt tearing through his chest. But he knew that no matter how bitter he was, he would not allow himself to break. He will move on and think about how to live without this lie, without these fruitless attempts to save something that has long been cracked. Mark didn't think long about where to go after he slammed the door of the house that he had recently considered his own. He rented a small apartment in the city center, a modest but comfortable place with minimal furniture. A bed, a table, a couple of chairs, and a wardrobe. He didn't need much. He always valued functionality over frills. The windows looked out onto a noisy street, where cars honked and lights flashed in the evenings, but this did not annoy him. On the contrary, the rhythm of the city helped to drown out the inner emptiness that threatened to overwhelm him after the breakup with Emily. He spent the first days sorting out his things and putting his thoughts in order. No tears, no attacks of self-pity. Mark did not allow himself to sink to this. He methodically put clothes on shelves, connected his laptop, and checked work emails. Everything that reminded him of the past photographs, small gifts from Emily, even an old blanket she loved remained in the box, which he pushed into the far corner of the closet. He had no intention of clinging to memories that now seemed false to him. Work remained his anchor. The consulting company where he held the post of senior analyst was in full swing with projects, and Mark was immersed in numbers, reports, and meetings with clients. But the evenings, when the office was empty and his colleagues went home, became a test for him. The silence of the apartment was oppressive, and he quickly realized that sitting within four walls was not his way. So he began to frequent the old Oak Bar more often, a small establishment 2 blocks from his new home. Old Oak was a place with soul. Wooden walls, worn by time, the dim light of lamps hanging above the counter, and the smell of whiskey mixed with the aroma of roasted peanuts created an atmosphere of comfort and unobtrusive freedom. A variety of people gathered here, from local workers to random tourists, but Mark appreciated the bar because no one bothered to talk to him if he didn't want to. He sat at the bar, ordered a whiskey and soda, and watched life flow by. The bartender deftly poured beer, someone laughed in the corner, someone argued about politics. It was his way of rebooting. It was there that he first noticed Sarah. She worked as a waitress short, with dark red hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and quick, confident movements. Her green eyes caught the light of the lamps, and there was always a slight smile on her face, not cloying, but sincere, as if she knew some secret that made her everyday life a little easier. Sarah was one of those who knew how to keep a balance. She could joke with a noisy group, but immediately switch to a calm tone if she saw that the visitor just needed to leave him alone. The first time, Mark didn't pay much attention to her. He came to Old Oak after a long day at work, ordered his usual whiskey, and buried his face in his phone, watching the news. Sarah brought him a glass, placed it on the counter with a slight knock, and said, "Whiskey and soda, right?" "Yes," he answered briefly, without even looking up. "Good choice," she said casually, and went off to serve other guests. Her voice was slightly hoarse, with warm notes, but Mark did not attach any importance to this then. He was not in the mood for acquaintances, and all the wounds from Emily's betrayal were too fresh. His need for solitude was too great. But Sarah, without knowing it, began to gradually break into his field of vision. A couple of days later, he found himself back at the bar. Mark took his place at the counter, watching Sarah deftly maneuver between tables, balancing a tray of beer mugs and plates of appetizers. One of the visitors, a tipsy guy in a leather jacket, tried to grab her hand, laughing loudly. "Hey, beauty, sit with us. Why are you running?" Sarah dodged without spilling a drop, and with a smile that showed steel, she answered, "I run so you can drink your beer and not wait until the morning for it." "Sit still, okay?" The guy was embarrassed, and his friends laughed, slapping him on the back. Mark couldn't help but chuckle as he looked at this scene. There was a sense of strength in Sarah, not brute, not ostentatious, but one that manifests itself in the ability to keep the situation under control. This appealed to him. He himself always appreciated people who do not lose dignity, even when there is chaos around them. When she approached him with another order, he looked at her more closely for the first time. She was wearing a black t-shirt with the bar's logo, jeans, and worn sneakers. No pretentiousness, no attempts to attract attention, and yet there was something attractive about her. Maybe her confidence. Maybe it was the way she moved quickly, but without fuss. "Whiskey and soda again?" she asked, placing the glass in front of him. "Yes. Stability is my everything," he answered with slight irony. "I understand," she nodded. "Sometimes it's better to know what to expect than to experiment and get burned." She said it so simply, without hints, but Mark suddenly caught himself thinking that her words had touched something inside. He nodded, took a sip, and for the first time that evening felt the tension in his shoulders ease a little. From that day on, he began to notice her more often. Sarah was not talkative. She did not intrude on conversations, did not try to find out who he was and why he came here almost every evening. But gradually short dialogues began between them. Sometimes she would make a joke about his predictable taste. Sometimes he would answer something like, "What else can you order in a place like this?" This was not flirting, rather, a light exchange of remarks that helped Mark take his mind off heavy thoughts. One rainy evening, when the bar was almost empty, Sarah lingered at his table a little longer than usual. Mark sat with his laptop, looking at the worksheet. He sometimes brought work to the Old Oak, so he wouldn't have to spend too much time in the apartment. She put the glass in front of him and, noticing the screen, asked, "Did you come here to work? This is a bar, not an office." "Sometimes a change of scenery helps," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "It's too quiet at home." "I understand," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Silence is sometimes worse than noise. You begin to hear your thoughts, and they are not always good interlocutors." Mark looked up at her. There was no pity or curiosity in her words, just a statement of the fact, as if she herself had gone through this more than once. He nodded without going into detail, but for the first time he thought that Sarah might not just be a waitress carrying trays for a paycheck. There was a depth to her that she did not show off. "And you?" he asked suddenly. "Why do you work here?" She shrugged, but there was a sparkle in her eyes. "Like, people are different. Every evening is like a little adventure. Plus, I am my own boss according to my schedule. And also—" She paused, smiling. "The whiskey here is not bad, even if you always mix it with soda." Mark chuckled, and for the first time in a long time his smile was sincere. Sarah went to other guests, and he remained sitting, looking after her. She didn't try to hook him, didn't make eyes at him, didn't play games. And that's what captivated him. After Emily's lies and manipulations, Sarah's simplicity seemed like a breath of fresh air. One day, when he stayed late at the bar, Sarah finished her shift and, instead of leaving, sat down with him at the counter with a mug of tea. It was raining outside, the windows were fogged up, and a rare silence reigned in the old oak. "Aren't you afraid that I'll start asking you questions?" she asked with a sly smile, warming her hands on her mug. "Depends on the questions," he answered, closing the laptop. "Aren't you afraid that I'll start asking them to you?" "Try it," she challenged, and interest lit up in her eyes. Mark leaned back in his chair, looking at her. He wasn't going to dump his story with Emily on her too soon, too personal. But he suddenly wanted to know who she was, this red-haired waitress who so easily held his attention. "Okay," he said. "Why Old Oak? You could have worked anywhere, but you chose this bar." Sarah thought for a moment, took a sip of tea, and answered, "This is the real thing. People come here not to pretend, but to be themselves. Some get drunk, some argue, some just remain silent like you. I love watching this. Plus, the owner is old Jack. He's like a second father. Once upon a time, he gave me a chance, and I stayed." Mark nodded. Her answer was simple, but there was a sense of honesty in it. He suddenly realized that he was comfortable around her not because she entertained him, but because she did not demand anything extra from him. "And you?" she asked, tilting her head. "Why are you here almost every evening? It's not like you're the type to drown your sorrows in whiskey." "Maybe I just like the atmosphere," he answered evasively. "Or you're running away from something," she added quietly, but without pressure. Mark met her gaze and wondered for a second whether he should open up. But instead, he just grinned. "Maybe so. Or maybe I just like whiskey and soda." Sarah laughed short, but loudly, and this sound relieved the tension that he had not even noticed in himself. She stood up, finished her tea, and said, "Okay, mysterious stranger, see you tomorrow. Don't stay here too long." She left, leaving behind a light aroma of mint tea and the feeling that something new might be starting in his life. Mark finished his whiskey, looking at the empty counter. He wasn't looking for a relationship. He didn't want to rush headlong into the pool. But Sarah, she was like a new rhythm, which he could not yet grasp, but which was already beginning to sound in his head. He walked out of the bar into the rain, turned up the collar of his jacket, and went home. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel lonely, and it was strange, but damn nice. Mark continued to frequent the old oak almost every evening, and gradually his meetings with Sarah became more than just an exchange of jokes at the bar. It wasn't like a movie romance, no long glances or casual touching. Everything happened naturally, as if both of them, without saying a word, decided that they could trust each other only as much as they were willing to open up. Mark was in no hurry, and Sarah, apparently, is not one of those who pry into someone's soul without an invitation. But each time their conversations became a little longer, a little deeper. One evening, midweek, the bar was almost empty. A light rain was drizzling outside the window, and the rare visitors quickly went home. Mark was sitting at his usual place at the counter, sipping whiskey, when Sarah finished wiping down the tables and, glancing at her watch, walked over to him. "We're closing early today," she said, taking off her apron and hanging it on the hook behind the counter. "Jack went to his sister, and there's nothing to do here without him. You are the last hero standing on the defensive." Mark grinned as he looked at her. Sarah was wearing a dark green sweater with the sleeves rolled up, and her red hair, usually tied into a ponytail, was slightly disheveled after a long shift. She looked tired, but not exhausted. Her movements still carried the same confidence that he had noticed the first time. "Would you like to go for a walk?" she suddenly suggested, nodding towards the door. "It's raining lightly, but I need to get some air. Unless, of course, you're afraid of getting wet." Mark thought for a second. Normally, he would refuse. He didn't like spontaneous decisions, preferring to keep everything under control. But something in her tone, in this slight mockery, pushed him to agree. "Okay," he said, finishing his whiskey and standing up. "But if I catch a cold, I'll send you a bill for the medicine." Sarah laughed, grabbed her jacket, and was the first to step towards the exit. They went outside, and the cold air immediately hit their faces. The rain was light, but persistent small drops settled on my hair and shoulders. The street was empty, only the streetlights reflected in the puddles, creating golden spots on the asphalt. They walked along the sidewalk, slowly, and were silent for a while. The silence between them wasn't awkward. Rather, it was an opportunity to simply be close. "You don't look like your typical barfly," Sarah said, putting her hands in her jacket pockets. "Most people come here to get drunk or whine about life. And you just sit and remain silent, as if you are thinking about something important." "Maybe I just like whiskey," he replied with his usual irony, but she shook her head. "No, this is different. You're not the type to hide behind a glass. More like the kind of person who deals with problems and then comes here to take a breather." Mark glanced at her. She didn't press or pry, but her words hit the mark. He suddenly realized that he wanted to tell her more, not because he was looking for sympathy, but because she seemed like someone who would understand without further ado. "You're right," he said finally, looking at the wet asphalt under his feet. "I'm really figuring something out. Or, more accurately, I've already figured it out." Sarah slowed down and looked at him. Interest flashed in her green eyes, but she did not rush him. She simply waited. "I had a wife," he began, and his voice sounded evenly, without trembling. "Emily, 6 years of marriage. Everything was normal, as I thought, until she changed. She became secretive and aloof. I felt something was wrong, but I didn't want to make a scene. I thought it would go away on its own." He paused, and Sarah nodded to show that she was listening. They turned into a small park where trees offered some protection from the rain, and stopped under an old oak tree, ironic, given the name of the bar. "And then I found out the truth," Mark continued, looking into the distance. "She admitted that she cheated on me. By chance, as she said. I met some Trevor in a bar, got drunk, and everything started to spin. She said that it was a mistake and that she regrets it. But I saw that she had been lying to me for months. I hid my phone, made up excuses, spent the night somewhere under the pretext of work. And even after I confessed, I tried to make it look like I was to blame. I didn't pay attention to her. I didn't notice her loneliness." Sarah exhaled quietly, but did not interrupt. She stood nearby, slightly bowing her head, and the rain left small drops on her hair. "I left," he finished, clenching his fists in his jacket pockets. "I didn't shout, I didn't forgive her. I just packed my things and left. Because I'm not going to live with a person who betrayed me and then makes excuses instead of taking responsibility." He fell silent, and silence hung in the air, broken only by the rustling of the rain. Mark expected Sarah to say something trivial, like, "I'm sorry," or "You did the right thing." But she surprised him. "You know," she began, looking at him with a slight smile, "most people in your place would either break or begin to take revenge. And you just left. That's power, Mark. Not everyone can do this." He met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like someone truly understood his choice. He did not condemn, did not regret, but accepted it as a given. "I don't see the point in revenge," he said, "and I'm not going to break down either. She made her choice, I made mine. It's simple." "It's not that simple," Sarah objected, and there was not a drop of sarcasm in her voice. "Leaving something that has been part of your life for 6 years and not looking back is not easy. But you're right that you didn't bother. People who lie and betray are not worth holding on to." Mark nodded, feeling how her words lifted some invisible burden from him. He did not seek consolation, but her directness and calmness affected him better than any long speeches. "What's wrong with her now?" Sarah asked as they walked forward again, walking along the wet path. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "and I don't want to know. She called a couple of times and wrote, but I didn't answer. I have nothing to say to her. Everything that happened between us ended the moment she chose to lie." Sarah looked at him with a slight squint, as if assessing how firm he was in his decision. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said, "so you are free. Not in the sense of go look for a new wife, but in the sense of the past. This is rare." They reached the end of the square and stopped at the intersection. The rain had almost stopped, leaving behind only a wet sheen on the asphalt. Sarah turned to him with her hands in her pockets. "Well, mysterious stranger," she said with a slight mockery, "will you go home or should I accompany you?" "I'll get there," he answered, smiling back. "But if anything happens, I know where to find you." "Old Oak," she nodded. "Always there if you suddenly want to chat more in the rain." She waved her hand and walked in her direction, and Mark looked after her, feeling something thawing inside. He was not going to rush into a new relationship. He was not looking for salvation in someone else. A week has passed since that rainy evening when Mark first opened up to Sarah. He still came to the Old Oak regularly, but now his visits were not only a way to distract himself. He liked to see her, hear her voice, catch her witty remarks. However, thoughts about the past did not completely disappear. They lurked somewhere on the edge of consciousness, like a shadow that he tried not to notice. But one little thing still made him return to the house he left behind. He needed a folder with documents, old contracts, and records that he kept before working at the consulting company. They were kept in a desk drawer in his and Emily's office, and in his haste to leave, Mark had not taken them. At first, he thought about asking one of his mutual friends to pick up the papers, but then he decided that he would do it himself. He didn't want to hide or avoid Emily. He was confident that he could control himself, as always. It was just a formality, a point in the past that needed to be put. On Saturday morning, he got into the car and drove to the suburb where their house stood. The road was familiar to the smallest detail: a turn near an old oak tree, a long alley with neatly trimmed bushes, a white fence near the neighboring plot. But now it all seemed alien, as if he was not going home, but to some forgotten place from another life. When he parked at the garage, his heart sank for a second, not from melancholy, but from the cold realization that there was nothing of his here anymore. Mark got out of the car, straightened the collar of his jacket, and headed towards the front door. He wrote Emily a short message in advance. "I'll pick up the documents at 10 a.m. I won't be long." She answered with a dry okay, and he hoped that there would be no further talk. He left the key to the house with her, so she had to ring the doorbell. A minute later, the lock clicked and Emily appeared on the threshold. She looked different from what he was used to. His hair was pulled back into a messy bun, there were dark circles under his eyes, and instead of the usual confident smile, something between fatigue and anxiety froze on his face. She was wearing an old sweatshirt, the same one she liked to wear on weekends when they made breakfast or watched movies together. But now this image did not evoke any warmth or nostalgia in Mark, only slight irritation that she seemed to be trying to play on his feelings. "Hi," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him pass. "Come in." "I won't be long," he answered, without looking her in the eye, and walked into the living room. Almost nothing has changed in the house. The same sofas, the same paintings on the walls, the same smell of coffee, which she apparently just brewed. But all this now seemed to him like decoration, an empty shell from which life had gone. He headed straight to the office on the second floor, without stopping or looking back. Emily followed silently, keeping her distance. In the office, he quickly found the necessary folder. It was lying in the same place where he had left it, in the top drawer of the table. Mark pulled it out, checked the contents, and was about to leave when Emily spoke. "Mark, wait," her voice trembled, and he froze without turning around. "Can we talk?" "About what?" he asked coldly, turning to her. "I came for documents, not for conversations." She took a step closer, nervously fiddling with the hem of her sweatshirt. "I know you're angry, and you have the right to be," she began, trying to speak calmly. "But I keep thinking that we could fix this. We haven't filed for divorce yet. Maybe this is a chance. We could go to a psychologist and try again. I don't want to lose you." Mark looked at her, and there was not a drop of doubt in his gaze. Her words sounded sincere, but he knew too well what was behind them: not love, but the fear of being left alone, the habit of a comfortable life that he provided for her. He exhaled slowly, holding back the outburst of anger that threatened to burst out. "To correct?" he asked, and there was an icy mockery in his voice. "What exactly do you want to fix, Emily? That you cheated on me?" The thing that she lied to my face for months, or the fact that even now you are trying to pretend that you can just forget about it? She turned pale, but did not back down. I know what I did, she said, her eyes shining with tears. I made a mistake, a huge mistake. But I love you, Mark. We've been together for so many years, that means something. We can start again, I swear never again. Enough, he cut her off, and his tone was as hard as steel. There is no need for these vows. You've already lost everything, Emily. You lost me the moment you decided you could betray me and then hide behind a lie. I'm not going to play these games and pretend that everything can be fixed. She stepped towards him, holding out her hand, but he stepped back, not allowing her to touch. Mark, please, her voice broke into a sob. I don't want a divorce. I don't want it to end like this. We were happy. We were, he agreed, looking her straight in the eyes, until you ruined it. And don't say that I'm the one leaving you. You made your own choice when you went to this Trevor. You're the one who ruined our marriage, and now you want me to go back and pretend like nothing happened. No, Emily, I'm not one of those who live with betrayal at my side. She covered her face with her hands, and tears streamed down her cheeks. But Mark did not flinch. He had seen her tears before, heard her excuses, and all this no longer touched him. There was only cold clarity inside him. He knew what he was doing, and was not going to back down. I'm filing for divorce, he said calmly, but with such confidence that she shuddered. My lawyer will contact you next week. Everything will be quick and without unnecessary drama. I want nothing from you but freedom. Mark, no. She whispered, lowering her hands and looking at him with despair. You can't just leave. We're family. We were a family, he corrected. Now this is just a formality that I'm going to finish. You're not my family anymore, Emily. You chose another life, and I chose mine. He took the folder under his arm and headed towards the door. Emily rushed after him, grabbing his sleeve. Wait, she almost shouted. I'll do whatever you want. I will change. I will prove to you. Mark stopped but didn't turn around. He carefully released his hand from her grip and said without raising his voice, You've already proven who you are. That's enough. Goodbye, Emily. With these words, he left the office, went down the stairs, and headed towards the exit. She remained standing at the top, clinging to the railing, and her quiet sobs echoed in the empty house. Mark didn't look back. He opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and breathed in the fresh morning air. The sun was breaking through the clouds, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that this light was for him. Getting into the car, he placed the folder on the passenger seat and started the engine. As the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, only one thought was spinning in my head. It's over. And this was not a defeat, it was a victory. He did not break, did not succumb to her tears and persuasion. He chose himself, his pride, his life. Divorce will only be a formal stamp on what he has already decided. On the way back to town, Mark turned on the radio, and the old rock music that Sarah loved so much filled the cabin. He smiled at the corner of his lips. Ahead of him lay Old Oak, an evening at the bar, and perhaps another conversation with someone who does not lie or betray. And it was a damn good feeling to know that he was moving forward and not looking back. I'm guessing there was a slight typo in your query. You probably meant that Emily shows up unexpectedly at the Old Oak Bar where Mark is chilling with Sarah. Based on this, I will write a chapter where Emily tries to intervene and Mark firmly puts her in her place, remaining firm and not allowing her to manipulate him. Here's the continuation. The evening at Old Oak was one that Mark began to appreciate more and more. The bar hummed with the usual noise, glasses clinking, laughter in the corner, muffled rock from the old jukebox. He sat at the counter, sipping a whiskey and soda, and Sarah, having finished her shift, settled down next to a mug of herbal tea. They chatted about trifles, about how she once spilled beer on some important client, and how he then left her a generous tip so that she would not worry. Mark listened, occasionally inserting his dry but accurate comments, and for the first time in a long time he felt at ease. You should have seen how I once dropped my coffee at a presentation in front of the whole team, he said, grinning. I had to pretend that this was part of the plan. Sarah laughed, throwing her head back, and her laughter was so infectious that Mark couldn't help but smile wider than usual. They didn't notice how time flew by until the bar door slammed a little louder than usual, catching their attention. Mark turned around and his face instantly hardened. Emily stood in the doorway. She looked different from her last meeting. Her hair was neatly styled, she was wearing a dark coat and high-heeled boots, as if she was specially preparing for this appearance. Her gaze immediately found his, and there flashed a mixture of determination and nervousness. Mark tensed, but did not look away. He knew that this was not an accident. She had come here on purpose. Sarah, noticing his reaction, followed his gaze and quietly asked, "Is this her?" "Yes," he answered briefly, putting the glass on the counter. His voice was smooth, but there was steel in it. Emily walked straight towards him, ignoring the curious glances of several visitors. She stopped a couple of steps from the counter, clasped her hands in front of her, and spoke. "Mark, I knew I would find you here. We need to talk." He didn't even move, just squinted slightly, looking down at her. Sarah silently pushed her mug away. Watching the scene but not interfering, she clearly understood that Mark could handle it on his own. "We have nothing to talk about," he said coldly. "I said everything last time. Leave." Emily pretended not to hear and stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Please listen to me. I can't live like this knowing that you hate me. I want to make things right, Mark. We can—" "Stop," he interrupted her, and his tone was so harsh that she involuntarily fell silent. He stood up from his chair, straightened up to his full height, and looked at her as if she were a stranger. "Don't you understand? It's over between us. You don't correct betrayal with a few words and a pitiful look. Go away, Emily. Now." She hesitated, clearly not expecting such harshness. Her eyes sparkled, but the tears, which previously could have embarrassed him, now only caused irritation. "I don't want a divorce," she said, raising her voice to get his attention. "I love you, Mark. You can't just erase me from your life like nothing happened." Her words hung in the air, and the bar became quiet. Several heads turned in their direction. Mark clenched his jaw, but did not let his emotions escape. He stepped towards her, closing the distance, and spoke quietly, but with such force that every word hit like a hammer. "You crossed yourself out when you went to bed with someone else. Do you think you can come here, make a scene, and I'll run to console you? No, Emily. You lost me, and it's your choice, not mine. I'm filing for divorce, period. Now get out of here before I say something you'll regret more than I do." Her face turned pale, her lips trembled, but she still tried to say something. "Mark, I—" "Go away," he repeated, and there was not a drop of doubt in his voice. "I don't need you anymore, and don't you dare come here again." Emily froze, as if hoping that he would soften, but his gaze was unyielding, cold as ice and hard as stone. She finally retreated, taking one last look at Sarah, who had been sitting silently the entire time, with a slight smile on her lips. Emily turned around and quickly walked out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Mark exhaled slowly as he returned to the counter. He sat down, picked up his glass, and took a sip as if nothing had happened. Anger boiled inside him, but he did not allow it to splash out, not here, not now. Sarah looked at him with a slightly raised eyebrow. "Well, you're not kidding when you say it's over," she said with a slight mockery, but there was respect in her tone. "I don't like to repeat myself," he answered, looking into the glass. "She wanted a show, but I'm not going to play by her rules." Sarah nodded, taking a sip of her tea. "She thought she could bring you back," she said thoughtfully, "but you are not one of those who can be persuaded with tears. This is good." Mark met her gaze and relaxed for the first time that evening. There was no pity or condemnation in her words, only understanding, which he valued most. Mark and Sarah continued to meet at Old Oak, and their interactions became increasingly casual. They didn't call it friendship out loud, but something warm and real grew between them without haste, without unnecessary expectations. Mark appreciated her directness and ease, and she seemed to find in him a reliability that she lacked in other people. But one evening, everything changed. It was a normal Thursday, the bar was half empty, and Sarah, as always, finished her shift earlier than usual. She sat down with Mark at the bar, holding a mug of tea, and they chatted about some nonsense. I think it was about how old Jack, the bar owner, once mixed up the orders and served beer instead of lemonade. Sarah laughed, but Mark noticed that her movements were a little more constrained than usual. She kept adjusting the long sleeve of her jacket as if trying to hide something. As she reached for a napkin, her sleeve rode up, and Mark caught a dark spot on her wrist out of the corner of his eye. He took a closer look. It was a bruise, fresh, with purple edges, clearly visible on her fair skin. His gaze involuntarily lingered, and Sarah, noticing this, quickly pulled down her sleeve, but it was too late. "What is this?" he asked quietly, but with such intonation that she realized that she couldn't brush it off. "It's okay," she answered too quickly, looking away. "I hit myself at work." She grabbed the tray unsuccessfully. Mark didn't believe it for a second. He understood people too well not to notice the falseness in her voice. He put down his glass and turned to her, crossing his arms over his chest. "Sarah, don't lie to me," he said calmly but firmly. "It's not from the tray. Who did it?" She pursed her lips, looking into her mug, and remained silent. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of the napkin, and Mark realized that behind her usual confidence was hiding something that she did not want to talk about. But he wasn't about to back down, not when it came to her. "Sarah," he repeated, lowering his voice, "I won't put pressure, but I see that something is wrong with you. Tell me." She finally looked up at him, a mixture of fear and fatigue flashing in her green eyes. She took a deep breath, as if gathering strength, and said quietly, "This is Curtis, my ex." Mark tensed, but did not interrupt, allowing her to continue. "We broke up more than a year ago," she began, lowering her eyes. "He was complicated. At first everything was fine, but then he began to control my every step. He was jealous, yelled, and pushed me a couple of times. I left as soon as I realized that this would not change. But he doesn't let go. Finds me, comes here, sometimes waits at the house. Usually I cope by avoiding him and not answering him. But the day before yesterday he caught me at the entrance. He grabbed my hand and demanded to talk. I escaped, but here." She lifted her sleeve again, showing the bruise, and Mark saw that he was not alone. Another, slightly paler one, stretched along the forearm, like a mark from a strong grip. His face darkened, but he held back the anger that began to boil inside. He did not tolerate those who raise their hands against others, especially those who cannot fight back. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "Because I didn't want to involve anyone," she answered with a shrug. "That's my problem. I thought he would get tired and fall behind. But he doesn't leave, and I don't know what to do." Mark was silent for several seconds, looking at her. He saw how she tried to seem strong, but in her voice slipped the helplessness that she hated in herself. And it hit him harder than he expected. Sarah wasn't the type to ask for help, but he wasn't going to wait for the situation to get out of control. "Where does he live?" he asked finally, and there was not an iota of doubt in his tone. Sarah frowned as she sensed his intentions. "Mark, no. I don't want you to interfere. This is dangerous. He is inadequate. I myself." "You can't handle it yourself if he's already got bruises," he interrupted, and his voice became harsher. "I'm not going to sit and watch him pester you. Give me the address." She shook her head, but Mark leaned closer, looking her straight in the eye. "Sarah, I'm not asking permission. I'll do it because I can. You're not a stranger to me, and I won't let some bastard ruin your life. Speak." Her resistance wavered. She knew that Mark was not one to mince words, and there was something in his gaze that made her believe that he would not back down. She sighed and said quietly, "He lives on the outskirts, in the old area. 17 Maple Street, but Mark, promise me you won't get into a fight. He's not worth it." "I'm not going to fight," he replied, although there was a flash of cold determination in his eyes. "I'll just talk to him, so that he understands." The next day Mark took a day off from work. He did not tell Sarah about his plans. He knew that she would be against it. But he couldn't sit idly by, knowing that some Curtis was threatening her. This was not in his rules. He put on a dark jacket, got into the car, and drove to the address she gave. Maple Street turned out to be a rundown area. Shabby houses, rusty cars on the side of the road, trash scattered by the wind. House 17 was a two-story building with peeling paint and a broken window on the first floor. Mark parked nearby, got out, and looked around. At the entrance stood a guy of about 30 tall, thin, with a tattoo on his neck and a cigarette in his mouth. According to Sarah's description, it was Curtis. Mark approached him without haste, keeping his hands in his pockets. Curtis noticed him, narrowed his eyes, and spat out his cigarette. "Who are you?" he asked roughly, looking Mark up and down. "Sarah's friend," Mark answered calmly, but there was a threat in his voice. "And I'm here to tell you one thing. Leave her alone." Curtis chuckled, crossing his arms. "So what? She's my girl, and I'll figure out what to do with her myself." Mark stepped closer, and his gaze became icy. He didn't raise his voice, but every word sounded like a blow. "She's not yours, and if you come near her again, if I see even one new bruise on her, I will find you, and then it won't be a conversation. I know where you live, I know where you hang out. I have enough connections to make your life miserable, and I'm not kidding. Do you understand?" Curtis hesitated, clearly not expecting such confidence. He tried to object, but Mark didn't give him a chance. "Nod if you understand," he said, and his tone left no choice. Curtis swallowed and nodded reluctantly. Mark paused, looking into his eyes to make sure he got it, and then turned around and walked towards the car. He didn't look back. He knew that Curtis wouldn't dare follow him. It wasn't a bluff. Mark could really get him into trouble if he had to, but he hoped that one warning would be enough. A few days passed after Mark's conversation with Curtis, and the situation seemed to have calmed down. Sarah looked calmer, her movements behind the old oak counter became easy again, and her smile had the same sincere warmth. Mark didn't bring up the topic of their last conversation. He didn't like to go back to what he had already decided, and he was sure that Curtis had received a clear enough signal. But he was wrong. The evening at the bar was noisy. People flocked in after the work week, orders poured in one after another, and Sarah could barely manage to deliver the trays. Mark sat at his usual spot at the counter, watching her out of the corner of his eye. He noticed that she glanced at the door a couple of times, as if expecting something, but he chalked it up to fatigue. When the flow of visitors subsided a little, Sarah approached him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Are you going to be late today?" she asked with a slight smile, but a note of tension slipped into her voice. "If you don't mind," he replied, taking a sip of whiskey. "Is something wrong?" She hesitated, but shook her head. "No, everything is fine. It's a long day." Mark nodded without pressing, but something in her tone made him wary. He decided to stay until the end of her shift, not out of suspicion, but out of some kind of inner premonition. When the bar began to empty, Sarah went into the back room to change clothes, and Mark waited for her at the exit. The night was cool. The wind blew scraps of leaves along the street. He was leaning against the wall when he heard muffled voices around the corner of the building. One of them was hers, sharp but trembling. Mark straightened up and walked towards the sound. Around the corner, in a dark alley at the back exit of the bar, stood Curtis. He towered over Sarah, pinning her against the wall. His hand squeezed her shoulder, and his face was distorted with anger. Sarah tried to break free, but he was stronger. "I told you," Curtis hissed, leaning towards her. "You are mine, and no new boyfriend will change that. If your Mark doesn't keep up, he'll feel bad. Very bad, and then I'll come back for you." "Let me go," Sarah gasped, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "You won't do anything to him, do you hear?" Curtis grinned, but his grip only became stronger. "We'll see about that later," he began, but didn't have time to finish. Mark stepped out of the shadows, and his steps were so firm that Curtis turned around. Seeing him, he let go of Sarah and straightened up, clenching his fists. "Here he is," Curtis muttered, pursing his lips. "I told you to stay away." Mark stopped a couple of meters from him, not taking his eyes off. His face was calm, but in this calmness there was a threat, like before a lightning strike. He didn't look at Sarah, he knew she was fine, and now all his attention was focused on Curtis. "You don't understand," Mark said, and his voice was low, almost a growl. "I'm not asking. I told you to leave her alone. Have you decided that you can threaten her? To me?" Curtis stepped forward, trying to appear more confident than he was. "Do you think you're cool?" he said. "I'll smear you if you climb. And her too, if she doesn't stop running after you." Mark didn't flinch. He took a step forward, closing the distance, and looked straight into Curtis's eyes. "Try it," he said quietly, but with such force that Curtis involuntarily retreated. "But know this, if you touch her again, if you even think about approaching her, I won't stop talking. I'm not a random rescuer, Curtis. I'm the one who will end this if you don't stop yourself." Curtis clenched his jaw, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his gaze. He clearly didn't expect Mark to be so adamant. Sarah, standing against the wall, looked at them with concern, but did not interfere. She knew that Mark would not back down. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Curtis managed, but his voice was already weaker. "You don't know that," Mark answered, and there was not a shadow of bluff in his tone. "I have connections, money and patience to make your life hell. But I won't waste my time on you if you disappear right now. Last chance, Curtis. Go away and forget about her." Curtis swallowed, looking around as if looking for a way out. He glanced at Sarah, then back at Mark, and apparently realized that he had overestimated his strength. Gritting his teeth, he stepped back. "Okay," he muttered, "but this is not the end." "This is the end," Mark snapped. "If I see you next to her, you won't be well. And this is not a threat, it is a fact." Curtis stood there for another second, then turned around and quickly walked into the darkness of the alley, giving one last angry look. Mark watched him until he disappeared around the corner, and only then turned to Sarah. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, and her breathing was uneven. The bruise on her shoulder where Curtis held her was already starting to darken. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, coming closer. "Yes," she answered, but her voice trembled. He just appeared out of nowhere. I didn't think he would dare after your conversation." Mark clenched his fists, but immediately relaxed them so as not to scare her even more. "He won't fit anymore," he said firmly. "I'll take care of it." "Mark, don't," she began, but he shook his head. "Yes, Sarah, it's not your fault, and I won't let him think he can get to you. I'm getting into this seriously, and not because I need to prove something. I care about you, and I won't stand by while he threatens you. Or me." She looked at him, and gratitude mixed with anxiety flashed in her eyes. "You don't have to risk yourself," she said quietly. "I'm not taking any chances," he replied, his voice full of confidence. "I'm taking control of this." The next day, Mark did not wait for Curtis to check his words. He contacted a friend from a law firm who owed him a favor and asked him to collect information on Curtis' criminal records, debts, anything that could be used. It turned out that he already had a suspended sentence for fighting and a couple of complaints from neighbors. Mark was not going to carry out lynching, he was smarter. He filed a police report, including Sarah's testimony and his own, and obtained a temporary ban on Curtis approaching her. This was the first step. After Mark presented Curtis with a fait accompli and obtained a restraining order, he hoped that he would finally back down. Sarah also began to believe that the shadow of her ex was left behind. She began to smile more often, look around less, and their evenings at the old oak acquired a lightness that had been missing before. But Curtis was not one to give up quietly. His wounded pride and anger built up like a storm before striking, and he decided that he would not allow Mark and Sarah to live in peace. It all happened on Saturday evening. Mark and Sarah left the bar later than usual. She was late helping Jack with inventory, and Mark was waiting for her at the bar, scrolling through work notes on his phone. The night was dark, moonless, and a cold wind blew wisps of fog along the street. They decided to walk to her house, just a couple of blocks, and Mark insisted on walking her, despite her playful objections. "You take me too seriously," she said, pulling up the hood of her jacket. "I'm already a big girl, you know." "I know," he answered with a slight grin, "but I don't like leaving things halfway." They walked along a narrow street, illuminated by sparse lanterns, when Mark noticed a shadow flashing around the corner. His instincts, honed by years of working in stressful situations, worked instantly. He slowed down, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder to stop her. "What?" she asked, but he motioned for her to remain silent. At that moment, Curtis jumped out of the alley. His face was distorted with rage, and a knife flashed in his hand, not long, but sharp enough to inspire fear. Two men looked behind him, healthy guys, clearly tipsy, with empty glances and clenched fists. Curtis clearly wasn't going to take the risk alone. "I told you this isn't the end," he growled, looking at Mark. "Did you think I would be afraid of your threats? And you trash," he turned to Sarah, "will regret getting involved with him." Sarah stepped back, her breathing quickening, but she did not scream. She still had that strength that Mark had noticed from the very beginning. He stepped forward, blocking her with himself, and looked at Curtis with cold confidence. "You made a mistake," Mark said quietly. "The last one." Curtis grinned and waved to his friends. "Take him," he said, and he moved towards Sarah, raising the knife. Mark didn't wait. He knew that Curtis had the numerical advantage, but he had something better: ingenuity and years of training, which he did not advertise. In his youth, he took up boxing, and later, while working in consulting, he kept in shape in the gym, not for show-off, but for himself. And now it came in handy. The first of the attackers, a big man in a leather jacket, rushed at him with his fists. Mark dodged, using his momentum, and sharply hit his temple with his elbow. The guy collapsed as if he had been knocked down, without even having time to understand what had happened. The second hesitated, but was immediately kicked in the knee. A crunch and a scream broke the silence. Mark did not waste unnecessary movements, acting quickly and accurately. Curtis, seeing his accomplices fall, rushed to Sarah, but she was not helpless. She grabbed a small can of pepper spray from her pocket, the one she had been carrying with her since Curtis's first threats, and sprayed it in his face. He screamed, dropping the knife, and grabbed his eyes, but then tried to grope for her blindly. Mark rushed towards him. Curtis, despite the pain, managed to wave his hand, and the knife lying on the ground hit Mark on the side, not deeply, but enough for blood to seep through his jacket. Mark gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, and grabbed Curtis by the collar. In one motion, he threw him onto the asphalt, pinning him to the ground with his knee. "You're done," Mark growled, delivering a short but powerful blow to the jaw. Curtis went limp, but was still breathing. Sarah ran up to Mark, her eyes full of horror. "You're wounded," she exclaimed, noticing the blood. "Nonsense," he waved it off, although the pain began to throb. "Are you okay?" "Yes," she nodded, trembling. "We need to call the police." Mark nodded, taking out his phone with one hand while still holding Curtis with the other. He dialed 911, briefly described the situation, and gave the address. While they waited, he looked back at his two accomplices, one lying unconscious, the second whining, holding his knee. There was no more threat. The police arrived 10 minutes later, sirens cutting through the silence of the night and the alley filled with flashing lights. The cops quickly subdued Curtis and his friends, while the paramedics took care of Mark. The wound was shallow, but required stitches. While the bandage was being applied, he looked at Sarah as she gave her statement to the officer. Her voice trembled, but she held on. As Curtis was led away in handcuffs, he gave Mark an angry look. "You'll be sorry," he croaked. Mark stood up, despite the medic's protests, and walked closer to him, ignoring the pain in his side. "No, you'll regret it," he said quietly, but with such force that Curtis fell silent. "I have everything to bury you. Remember what I said about compromising evidence. You have probation for a fight, a debt of $20,000 to a local dealer, and 3 complaints for threats. I gave it to the cops. You will sit down for a long time. This is the end, Curtis." Curtis turned pale, realizing that Mark was not bluffing. The policeman pulled him to the car, and Mark returned to Sarah. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself and looked at him with gratitude and concern. "You almost died because of me," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't die," he answered, squeezing her shoulder with his good hand. "And I didn't intend to. I promised that I would take care of you, and I did." The officer approached them holding a notepad. "We took them," he said. "With your testimony and evidence, this is aggravated assault. Plus, he already has a criminal record. He won't get out." Mark nodded, taking out a flash drive from his pocket, the one his lawyer friend had given him. It contained copies of documents, Curtis's criminal record, promissory notes, recordings from street surveillance cameras where he threatened neighbors. He handed it to the cop. "Everything you need is here," he said. "Make sure he doesn't get out." The officer took the flash drive, nodded briefly, and left. The paramedics insisted that Mark go to the hospital, and he agreed only for the sake of Sarah, who looked like she was about to collapse from the experience. At the hospital, he received 5 stitches and was released with orders to rest. Sarah sat next to him in the waiting room, holding his jacket while he signed the papers. When they finally reached the street, she stopped and looked at him. "You're crazy," she said, but there was warmth in her voice. "You could have just left, but instead you got into a fight. For me. I don't leave when someone threatens those who are important to me," he answered, looking into her eyes. "You're not just someone, Sarah. I'm serious about this." She fell silent and then stepped towards him and hugged him carefully so as not to touch the wound. Mark hugged her back, feeling her warmth drive away the cold of the night. For the first time in a long time, he realized that he was ready to take risks not only for himself, but also for her. The next day, police confirmed that Curtis had been arrested. Taking into account the evidence, the attack, and the incriminating evidence that Mark had collected, he faced up to 10 years. His accomplices also went to trial, but Mark knew that he himself dealt the main blow not with his fists, but with calculation and determination. After the incident with Curtis, life began to improve for Mark and Sarah. Curtis was behind bars, the threat was over, and their evenings at the Old Oak became a time when they could just be themselves. But one shadow from the past still loomed on the horizon: Emily. Mark had long decided that their marriage was dead and filed for divorce a week after he took his documents from their shared home. He hired a lawyer, collected all the necessary papers, and was confident that the process would go quickly. However, Emily, as it turned out, was not going to let him go without a fight. She refused to sign the documents, saying that she didn't want to destroy the family. Mark expected resistance, but not this kind. Emily turned the divorce into a one-man show, full of drama and manipulation. She called him at night, left tearful messages, and begged him to meet for old time's sake. When he did not answer, she moved on to more desperate measures. She began showing up at his new apartment, knocking on the door, shouting across the threshold that they can still fix everything. Mark did not open, did not react, but her behavior infuriated him. He didn't want scenes, didn't want screams, he just wanted freedom. A court hearing was scheduled 2 months after the application was filed. Mark came to court in a formal suit with a folder of papers and a lawyer, ready for any surprises. Emily came with a theatrical look. Her eyes were red, her hair was disheveled, she was holding a handkerchief with which she kept wiping away her tears. Her lawyer, a young guy with a nervous look, clearly didn't know how to deal with her antics, but tried to maintain her line. The judge, an elderly woman with a tired face, began the hearing with formalities. Mark stated his position clearly. The marriage broke up due to Emily's infidelity. He sees no point in reconciliation, demands a divorce without division of property. He doesn't need anything from her except an official break. His lawyer added evidence correspondence between Emily and Trevor, which Mark received through mutual friends, and testimonies from neighbors about her nightly visits to him after leaving. Emily, having heard this, jumped up from her seat without waiting for her turn. "This is a lie," she shouted, theatrically wringing her hands. "He left me because I made one mistake. I love him. I want to save our family. Mark, tell them we can fix this." The judge tapped her gavel, calling for order, but Emily did not let up. She turned to Mark, her voice breaking into a squeal. You can't do this to me. 6 years, Mark. I've been with you for 6 years, and you just throw me out like trash. I didn't sign anything because I believe in us. Mark looked at her coldly, without moving. Her concert might have touched someone else, but not him. He saw right through this game. The tears, screams, accusations were just an attempt to regain the control that she had lost. He did not answer, leaving the floor to his lawyer, who dryly remarked, "My client does not want reconciliation. Her behavior confirms her unwillingness to accept reality. We ask the court to make a decision unilaterally." Emily began to sob louder, falling back into her chair and covering her face with her hands. Her lawyer tried to say something about the possibility of family therapy, but the judge interrupted him. "Enough. I see that reconciliation is impossible. Mrs. Harrington, your emotions don't change the facts. The court will consider the case based on the evidence presented." Emily stood up again, pointing at Mark with a trembling hand. "You will regret this," she shouted. "You think you can just leave and find someone better? I won't give you peace, Mark. You are my husband." Mark finally turned to her, and his gaze was so icy that she fell silent. He stood up, without waiting for the judge's permission, and spoke quietly, but with such force that every word was imprinted in the air. "I'm not your husband, Emily. You lost me when you betrayed me. You can scream, cry, put on a show as much as you want. It won't change anything. I'm leaving not because I found someone better, but because you turned out to be worse than I thought. Divorce is a formality. It's all over between us a long time ago, and I won't leave you any chance to return. Not a single one." He sat back down, and silence fell in the hall. Even Emily seemed to realize that she had crossed the line. Her tears continued to flow, but now they were more from powerlessness than from calculation. The judge made a decision half an hour later. The marriage was dissolved. The property remained with the parties without division, as Mark requested. Emily tried to object, but her lawyer whispered to her to be quiet, and she complied. When the hearing ended, Mark left the courthouse without looking back. Emily remained inside, still sobbing, but he felt neither pity nor relief, only cold clarity. He had done everything he could to break that connection, and now she was officially dead. On the street, fresh air awaited him, and the feeling that the last bridge had burned to the ground. In the evening, he went to Old Oak. Sarah noticed him immediately. He looked calmer than usual, although there was still a spark of tension in his eyes. She placed the whiskey and soda in front of him and asked, "How did it go?" "It's over," he replied, taking a sip. "The divorce has been finalized. She tried to start a circus, but I didn't give her a chance." Sarah nodded, crossing her arms over her chest. "She didn't want to let you go," she said thoughtfully. "But you are not one of those who can be restrained by force." "No one will keep me where I don't want to be," he said, looking into her eyes. "Neither screams nor tears. I told her there was nothing between us, and it was true. She is no longer a part of my life." Sarah smiled, not widely, but sincerely. "You are free, Mark. For real." He nodded, feeling the last threads of the past being cut off. Emily could cling to illusions as much as she wanted, but he did not leave her the slightest loophole. He didn't just leave, he erased her from his history, and that was his final word. "For freedom," he said, raising his glass. "For freedom," Sarah repeated, clinking her mug of tea with him. After the trial and the final break with Emily, Mark felt that the burden of the past had finally lifted from his shoulders. He didn't celebrate his divorce with much fanfare. That wasn't his style, but that night at the Old Oak, he ordered another whiskey and let himself relax. Sarah, as always, was nearby, and their conversations flowed easily, without tension. They didn't discuss the trial directly. She knew he'd done it, and that was enough. Every day their connection became deeper. It was not like a whirlwind romance, no passionate confessions, no hasty promises. Instead, they found something rare in each other: understanding without words, support without conditions. Mark valued her independence and integrity, and Sarah seemed to see him as someone she could rely on without losing herself. They spent more and more time together, not only in the bar, but also outside it. Sometimes we walked around the city, sometimes we sat in his apartment, listening to old rock and sharing stories from the past. One evening, a couple of weeks after the trial, they were sitting at Mark's. He put on a vinyl record of Led Zeppelin, one of the ones Sarah had mentioned in conversation, and they drank coffee, looking out at the city lights through the window. Sarah sat on the sofa, legs crossed, looking thoughtful. Mark noticed this, but did not rush her with questions. He knew what she would say if she wanted. "Have you ever thought about leaving everything and leaving?" she asked suddenly, looking at him. "I thought," he answered, putting the mug down, "after Emily. But then I realized that I had nothing to run from. I'd rather stay and build something of my own." She nodded, thoughtfully turning the mug in her hands. "And sometimes I want to run away," she admitted quietly, "from Curtis, from memories. But then I think, if I run away, he will still win, and I don't want to give it to him." Mark looked at her carefully. There was strength in her words, but also a weariness that she rarely showed. He suddenly realized that he wanted to be near her not just as a friend or protector, he wanted her to become a part of his life. Without haste, without pressure, but sincerely. "Move in with me," he said, and his voice was calm but firm. "I have enough space, and you won't have to look around, afraid he'll come back. We can be together, Sarah." She froze, looking at him in surprise. Her green eyes widened, and for a second it seemed like she didn't know how to respond. Then she looked down, pursing her lips. "Mark, she began, but fell silent, searching for words. "I'm not sure. Don't get me wrong, you are important to me. Very. But I can't say that this is love. I can't yet. It's all too fast, and I'm afraid of losing myself again." He nodded without looking away. Her honesty didn't surprise him. It was something he respected her for. He didn't want her to pretend or agree out of a sense of duty. "I understand," he said softly, but without a hint of disappointment. "I'm not putting pressure on you, Sarah. This is not an ultimatum. I just want you to know that you have a place next to me if you choose, and I will wait as long as necessary. Day, month, year, it doesn't matter to me. You decide for yourself when you are ready." She looked up at him, and gratitude flashed in her eyes. She smiled not widely, but warmly, as if his words had lifted some invisible burden from her. "You're strange, Mark," she said, shaking her head. "Most would be offended or start persuading, and you just wait." "I'm not the majority," he answered with a slight grin, "and I don't want you with me because of the pressure. If this happens, it will be only because you yourself want it." Sarah leaned back on the couch, looking at the ceiling. The music filled the silence, and for a while they just remained silent, enjoying the moment. Then she turned to him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "because you are like this. I'll think about it, okay? Not right now, but I'll think about it." "Think as much as you want," he answered, shrugging his shoulders. "I'm in no hurry." She smiled wider, and at that moment he realized that their connection was not just an accident. It was something real, growing slowly but surely, like a tree putting down roots into solid ground. He didn't know whether she would call it love tomorrow or in a year, but it was enough for him that she was nearby, honest, strong, real. The evening ended late. Sarah stayed with him to finish her coffee, and then he walked her home, as he had done more than once. She hugged him goodbye briefly but firmly and left, leaving behind a light aroma of mint tea. Mark looked after her, feeling ready to wait. Not because he needed to have her, but because she was worth the wait. 3 years have passed since the evening when Mark invited Sarah to move in with him. Time did not rush them. They walked towards their future slowly, but confidently, building relationships on trust and honesty. Sarah hesitated for a long time, but 6 months after that conversation, she finally agreed to live with Mark. Her things gradually filled his apartment: books, old records, a couple of her drawings on the walls. It wasn't a hasty decision. She chose him when she felt ready, and Mark waited as he promised. Their connection grew like a river that gained strength with every turn. They did not throw themselves into the pool headlong, but every day they found something new in each other. Mark proposed his hand and heart to her after a year of marriage, not with pomp, but simply over dinner at his home, with a ring that he chose himself. Modest, but with an emerald matching the color of her eyes. Sarah said yes without hesitation, and her smile told him everything he needed to know. The wedding took place quietly, surrounded by loved ones. No big dresses or hundreds of guests, just old man Jack from Old Oak, a few of Mark's friends from work, and a couple of Sarah's friends. They signed at City Hall and then celebrated at the bar where it all started. Jack raised a toast to two stubborn people who found each other, and everyone laughed, clinking glasses of whiskey and tea. A year after their wedding, their son was born, a little boy with dark red hair like Sarah's and Mark's calm brown eyes. They named him Liam, and with his appearance their lives were filled with a new rhythm. Mark, always reserved and firm, turned out to be an unexpectedly gentle father. He could hold his son in his arms for hours, telling him something in a quiet voice, while Sarah watched them with a smile. But the past did not disappear without a trace. Emily, having learned about Mark's child, could not come to terms with it. Her life after the divorce went downhill. She lost her job, started drinking, and clung to the illusion that Mark would return. When she heard rumors about Sarah and Mark's child through mutual friends who still crossed paths with Mark, something in her completely broke. She tracked down Sarah and waylaid her outside her house as she was returning from the store with Liam in the stroller. Emily appeared around the corner, her eyes wild, a kitchen knife trembling in her hand. She screamed something incoherent about how Sarah had stolen her life and how Mark should have been with her. Sarah, unfazed, pushed the stroller aside and grabbed the can of pepper spray that she still carried with her after Curtis. It splashed Emily in the face, and she screamed and dropped the knife. The neighbors called the police, and everything worked out. Sarah and Liam were not injured, and Emily was taken away in handcuffs. This incident was the last straw for her. At the police station, she had a nervous breakdown. She screamed and hit the walls until she was taken to the hospital. Doctors diagnosed severe depression and alcohol addiction. She was admitted to a clinic, and nothing has been heard from her since. Mark, having learned about this, only shook his head. He felt neither pity nor anger. Emily had ruined her own life, and he had erased her from his long ago. Now, on a warm spring evening, Mark and Sarah sat on the veranda of their new home, a small cottage outside the city that they had bought after Liam was born. The sun was setting, painting the sky gold and pink. Liam, who was 1.5 years old, sat in Mark's arms, fiddling with his shirt with his small fingers and babbling something in his tongue. Sarah sat next to him, resting her head on Mark's shoulder, looking at her son with a quiet smile. "He looks like you," she said, touching Liam's red locks, "just as stubborn." "And at you," Mark answered, grinning. "He already knows what he wants." She laughed, and this sound was dearer to him than anything else. He looked at her green eyes, at the slight wrinkles from laughter, at the calmness that she found next to him. Then he turned his gaze to Liam, who yawned and snuggled against his chest. This was his family, real, strong, built not on lies, but on the love that they both chose. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked suddenly, looking at him. "Yes," he answered simply, and it was the truth. "And you?" "Very," she said, squeezing his hand. "I didn't think I could do this. But with you, with both of you, I can." Mark leaned over and kissed her forehead, and then looked at his son, who was already falling asleep in his arms. The past remained somewhere far away. Emily, Curtis, all their threats and pain disappeared into the shadows. Now he had a home where laughter sounded, where he was expected, where he was needed. And he knew he had done everything right from his first step into Old Oak to this quiet evening with his wife and son. The sun set, and the stars began to appear in the sky. Mark hugged Sarah with one arm, holding Liam with the other, and felt like his life was finally complete. This was his new rhythm, calm, strong, and infinitely real. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.